is Paul Lawrence on 1:15:82. And we'll start with the first question, just your definition of field research.
Well, as you know, my field of study is organizational behavior, and to me, within that context, field research is simply studying behavior of people directly in organizations. It's anything that where you're in that organizational context setting, gathering data. So it's very simple and operational. I think the times that doing research that way is most appropriate is for my money when you're doing what I'd call exploratory research. There are a lot of reasons to do it, but I think that's the most general, powerful reason. When you're trying to understand some phenomenon that has not been very systematically studied, you're trying to get a overview of how it works, under what conditions it occurs, what are the accompanying phenomena, what are the antecedents and the outcomes of something that's not very well understood. You can go into a field setting and just watch it unfold and understand it in its complexity, even before you have even perhaps haven't identified what concepts are going to help you illumine that, or what even before you've formulated anything like a very tightly defined hypothesis about the phenomenon. So it's best for exploratory research. And you are in field settings, you're always dealing with, you can have some focal variables that you're most interested in, but you're going to be looking at a lot of variables, and so you're sort of forced to take a multivariate, sort of systemic way of looking at what you're doing. I guess among other things, you're interested in just by chatting about some of these things that come up in field research, and based on my experience with it. Site selection is terribly important. I think we all pick our sites to some extent by convenience and accessibility, and I don't minimize that. You have to get in or you can't do the research. But the more you can apply some criteria for selection that's based on a broader research design, there's no question you're going to come out with findings that'll have more power, because you can say more about what this is an example of if you have some criteria selection built into your site selection. And so I think it's worth giving that a lot of thought. I think it's worth going to some extra time and trouble to get into the sites that you have selected for design reasons, and it is one way of getting holding some things constant and getting a lot more leverage out of your findings. As far as getting access, I don't think I have anything very unique to say about that. It is a troublesome thing. It does take time. You have to be patient. You have to try, but there's no substitute for going ahead and making the request, even if one is a little bit uneasy about being turned down and so forth. My experience is that the batting average of getting in is good enough so that you just ought to proceed to pop the questions. And if you are trying to get inside an organization, it's always a good rule of thumb to start at the top. It is very difficult to get in a place when your original point of contact is in the junior levels. It's a fact of life that there's a power system in organizations, and the people who control the boundaries are the senior people, and they have to be sooner or later you have to get their agreement, and it's better to ask them first instead of second, third, fourth, or fifth. One thing that occurs to me in thinking about this interview and what might be useful, when I was a doctoral student, I did a lot of field work, and it was extremely valuable for my education. And I thought it might be of interest to spell that out a little bit. It's what I would call intensive field work is what I got exposed to. There are a lot of kinds of field work. Obviously, you can go in an organization and have a half-hour interview with each of 10 people in a structured situation where you make an appointment ahead of time and you go in and ask some standard questions and you get their answers and walk out and you've done your field work. That's one variety. I'm not knocking it, but the kind I'm thinking about, just to be sure we understand how it could work, is what I mean by intensive field work is when you pick a unit, say it's a factory, and you're going to study it intensively over multiple visits, over multiple weeks. And your purpose is to get to know in depth that entire system, the entire organization as an ongoing system. And I had experiences like that as a doctoral student, and that has always been really one of the, you might say, just a kind of a foundation of understanding organizations was built for me in that experience. And what you have to do, you have to go in and hang around a lot and sit down and talk to people at the bottom, at the top, at the staff groups, the specialists, the up and down the chain of command, so that they really get to know you. They get to understand that they can talk to you candidly without having repercussions, and they test you and they see whether or not they can tell you something, and if it leaks back to them, or somebody drops a word that makes them think that you've been carrying messages around in the system, because you have to be very disciplined to be a dispassionate, neutral observer that is not in itself, not in yourself, influencing the organization. Otherwise, people won't tell you what they really think. But I assure you that when you get to a point where you get to know enough of the people and have really gained their trust, and they find it is worth their time and trouble to talk to you, because they get something out of it. They enjoy having an audience and a sounding board. That you can get to a point where you can go into one of these factories and in about well, less than that, probably a couple hours, you could touch base with 30 people in all parts of the organization and get a update on all the things going on, you know, all the rumors, all the confusions, the tensions, the communications, the miscommunications, the people that are, who's fighting with whom and who's getting along with whom, and what's going out the door and what isn't going out the door, and you really, it's a tremendous feeling to be able to understand an organization in that in-depth way, because you learn about certain patterns that occur over and over again in organizations. You get to understand that what goes on when two groups are fighting with each other and what stages they go through and what all the machinations are. You get to understand that. You get to understand how chain of command can work, when it's working well and when it's working in various kinds of dysfunctional ways, when it is distorting communications, or when it is, you know, communications are moving well through the system. You get to understand how small groups work in those settings, what the problems are of trying to introduce change. And I think the you know, things like line staff relationships, I think that's an extremely valuable thing, and that's really intensive field work. It's not, it's just one variety, but it's one that I think we sometimes don't talk enough about and understand well enough so that people can use it as a basic tool of learning about organizations in an in-depth fashion.
Do you want to talk specifically now about, keeping on the topic of your doctoral training, specifically what you did at those times, and how, looking back on that now, X number of years later, whether you think of that research you did, how your ideas have changed? Well, I entered doctoral training in early 1947, as I remember, and got my degree in I had my MBA at that time, and got my degree in June of '50. There was a lot of emphasis on field work. The literature of organizational behavior at that time was, of course, much more limited than it is now. So
we didn't do as much reading books as we do nowadays, simply because there weren't many books to read on the subject, which gave us all that spare time to go out and observe organizations in action rather than reading about them. So right from the beginning, I remember, we'd start out, often it would come up in the form of, in connection with a course, we'd go out and, get a case, and that involved interviewing up to a point. But then under the direction of people I worked with then, like Fritz Roethlisberger, and this was just before Elton Mayo had left the school, so he was still around, but not for very long after that. And more particularly, I worked with George Lombard and Ed Learned. They were putting together for the first time, a new required course called Administrative Practices, which was the first time a required course in this subject matter had been offered here. So there's a need for a lot of new cases, and we decided to set up really 2 field sites where we did intensive work of this kind, and then once we got this kind of saturation understanding, we could pull out a case on this subject or a case on that subject out of these various settings and take it was simply picking some incident where you had a managerial choice factor, but then you could array around that incident the whole contextual aspects of it that we had become acquainted with just in the course of soaking up daily all the experiences of what was going on there. So that was a big part of how we got trained. It was, we'd come back from those sessions and we'd write up our field notes and we'd share them with our supervisors, and then we'd sit around in a small group and discuss what they meant and what we ought to look for next, and whether we're missing some important leads, and whether or not what would make a good teaching case, and what would be some patterns that we could see that might take the form of a research report. And I, of course, eventually got a dissertation out of that one field site, and what I wrote it on was the study of the whole introductory process of bringing a new product into the factory that was actually designed there, and all the blow-by-blow issues they had to work through to get it done. So that had implications for improving management practices in that regard. And another one of these field sites, I and a couple of colleagues got our first little publication out, a little book called Management Behavior and Foreman Attitude. Or was it the other way around? I've forgotten. But it was an analysis of the foreman's role and how the quality of performance there was influenced by the behavior in the chain of command above him and the line staff relations around him and so forth. And it was a focus on the life of the first line supervisor and what goes on there. So those were 2 products, and actually we got our book out while we're even before it got done, before the dissertation. But after the dissertation done, I and another colleague eventually wrote that up into the first kind of full-blown research monograph that I was involved in publishing, and that was done. So it had multiple products. It produced cases, it produced published research, it gave me a lot of understanding about organizational life, and I know when I started out teaching, I really felt fairly confident about what I was doing because, you talk about organizations, I really felt, I knew the beast, I had been around them enough so that I knew their typical problem areas and how they played themselves, the cycles that went on, vicious cycles, positive cycles, and so forth.
Where did you move next in your history, in your personal history, in relation to field research? You had the supermarket book come out in '58, you said. You must have done things.
Yeah, I guess that was probably the next big field-based research I did.
If you want to talk about how you led into the supermarket study and what you were doing for the 11 years from '47 to '58, maybe.
Well, I can't remember all that. I think I was teaching mostly. I started teaching first year administrative practices in 1950, and I was teaching throughout that time period. And I think I started that next significant size project around '53, and it didn't get published around 57, 58, but it was underway about 53. And I had there, it was mostly serendipity. It was no great site selection. I heard that that the senior person at at this major supermarket chain was going to be introducing a significant amount of organizational reform and reorganization, essentially geared to making, for the first time, having overall store managers in each of their supermarkets and giving that individual a lot more local discretion for issues of managing the people in the store, having some decisions about the kind of merchandise they're going to carry, the way they would display it, and in other ways get more decentralized action. And this represented a significant change because they had had a tradition of being very strongly guided from headquarters with district representatives traveling around and telling the people in the stores when to sneeze and when to blow their nose and all the rest, and I am not exaggerating. And so it was a change for a lot of people, and I decided to be the researcher that would track that effort to significantly shift the whole decision process closer to the store level. And I guess what I learned there, more than anything else, you know, we were of course doing interviews with all these folks, and but I learned quite a bit about observation and trying to do systematic field observations. And it is tricky and it is time-consuming, but I learned that you really could identify some strong patterns that you could get well documented on behavior patterns by doing some field observation work. I actually used a simplified set of observation categories that were borrowed from Fried Bale's framework that he was using at that time for observing small group behavior. And I adapted it for my own field observation purposes. I just took a little spiral notebook and kept I got a watch that had a nice big sweep second hand, and I would hold this in such a way that I could keep making, for every line I dropped down on the page was, as I remember, 30 seconds or so, maybe 15, I forgot how it worked. But I would draw a line down and put little symbols next to it as to who was talking about what, for how long, and where the interruptions came from, and coded the interaction. I was really coding the interaction between the district supervisor and the store manager, the newly appointed all-purpose store manager. And I was trying to find out whether there really was a delegation of decision-making going on or not at a basic, you know, moment-by-moment behavioral level. And the patterns began to emerge, and they were quite clear, and it depended an awful lot on who was the district manager. And if some district managers understood what was wanted, they did shift their behavior. They did interact with the store manager in such a way that they helped him think through his decisions and supported him in proceeding to take over more responsibility for the store. And other more traditional managers they were all kinds of instructions as to how they were supposed to do this. They were coached, they were trained, they were cajoled, they were evaluated, they were so forth and so on, to try and get them to supervise differently, and some didn't. And they would pay quite sincere lip service to the thing. They say, that's right, that's what we ought to do. It'll make for a better store. I believe in it. I'm 100% behind it. I'll do it all the time, boss. And you go out and watch them interact with their subordinates, and it's simply they did 90% of the talking, and they would, any question came up, they'd provide the answers, and they'd come back the next time and make sure it was done the way they wanted it. And it was so that and I was trying to figure out, you know, what makes or doesn't make for a significant change of that kind. And I looked at all the surrounding activities they were trying to use to reinforce this, such as evaluation schemes and reward schemes and training, coaching, modeling, you name it. They had a little bit of everything in there, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And but it was, you know, in terms of field work, I think what I learned is that you can invent your own observation tools. You can't invent them before you get in the field, because a lot of things, every field situation is bound to have its own characteristics, and you have to sort of go there and watch it a while and say, what are what do I want to see here? What is the behavior that I'm trying to record? What would be the means, the tools that could help me capture the regularities here? Because you know, you go into factories, and I've seen situations where the absolute average interaction between a foreman and whoever he's talking to may be no more than 4 seconds. That's the average. Well, if you design an observation scheme that's sort of designed to record, you know, an hour's worth of conversation, it doesn't really help you. You've got to get something that's geared to the 4-second interaction rate, and there's no way to know that until you get there.
A question that I was thinking of while you're talking about that, but typically, the response would be, but typically today, most research is really not done that way in business schools. Why do you think we're moving? Obviously, the onset of the computer and
that sort of intensive fieldwork thing?
Most people are just willing to hand out these massive questionnaires or surveys, and you know, and observation is only paid token lip service 3 or 4 days in the typical dissertation, I think.
Well, I think it's true that we don't do as much intensive fieldwork as I experienced earlier in my career, and we, you know, essentially we're trying to find shortcuts, like you know, trying to see what we can get strictly through standardized questionnaires. That we can scale and manipulate the numbers in all kinds of ways with computer analysis. I think computer has had a tremendous impact on our choice of methods. You know, the tool becomes available and we use more and other things less. I think and I think I'm not knocking that, but I think we have to recognize that you get a different kind of understanding of organizations using those more popular methods now than you do in more intensive fieldwork. I think with fieldwork you could get you can get a more systemic understanding. You can get a more complex, rich understanding of the multiple levels of behavior.
If you want to talk about moving into the next phase of your field research career, especially, I don't know whether it's premature to talk about your book you did with Jay, but that was certainly a well-received book, at least from what I hear, and a major methodological change for you, it looked like.
Well, I'd done a piece of research with Arthur Turner on, resulted in a monograph on called Industrial Jobs and the Worker, in which we had used a combination of questionnaires plus field observation of about 50 different kinds of blue-collar jobs in a variety of industries, where we're trying to find ways to scale the attributes of the work itself that would be most important to the way people would respond to that work situation. And so we had to spend a lot of time observing those jobs and seeing exactly what people did in those jobs and finding ways to scale that, and then give questionnaires to people to find out how they reacted to all this, as well as look at evidence like turnover and absenteeism and other indicators of a worker response. Well, to make a long story short, that led to a set of ideas that eventually led to the work I did with Jay Lorsch on that came out as Organization and Environment. Because in that earlier research in the field, I had observed that based on different kinds of markets and different kinds of technologies, we were seeing quite different kinds of management systems. And I began to think about whether there was some pattern to this that wasn't the original point of why we're in there, but I just began to see this. And again, fieldwork kind of put me out of that. So I got thinking about it and reading about it and designed the research study, and Jay was a doctoral student then. I got him involved and helped me with it. And that's a good example of site selection. Because I've been in the field, because I had some hypotheses about what we were looking for, we set it up so that we got a sample of companies or units within companies to look at that were distributed across some performance criteria, you know, high and low performer type thing in terms of economic outcomes. and in terms of the kind of rates of change, the amounts of uncertainty that were generated by that kind of business in terms of fast technical change, market shifts, things of that kind. So we went in with that kind of a grid of circumstances we were looking for, and we picked industries that varied on uncertainty, and we picked within that industry units that varied on performance. So the whole design was built right into the selection of the site. And once we did that, then we could kind of put that issue aside and go in and see, you know, what's there and take a good look inside. And we used a variety of methods. We used questionnaires, we used extensive interviews, we used observations of group meetings with managers. It was the study focused mostly on managerial behavior, and we simply used a full gamut of methods, including archival evidence about economic outcomes. But I do think the thing that is interesting, maybe from this standpoint, is that I got the lead for the hypothesis from an earlier field research, which was just a unexpected dividend from that research, which led to the framework that gave us the basis of making those site selections, which allowed us to highlight some interesting contrasts between different kinds of organizations and led to our ideas about differentiation and integration and different orientations and different functional groups, all that sort of thing. So I guess it's an example of the fact that I've always argued that we do need to understand a mix of methods. There is no, we have to be careful not to get trapped by our methods into you know, using a tool regardless of what we're trying to do with it, and that almost any tool you use, though, for doing field work, anything you want to emphasize, like questionnaires or other things, I think it's very important to take the time to supplement your major methods with the backup method of some good old-fashioned interviews, because it makes it much easier to communicate your findings. It helps you deal. It is the chief way you can communicate to practitioners, managers who want to have some feel for what you're talking about, and if you give them quotes and people describing it, I think it helps you interpret your numbers. And it's one of the ways that I found, one of the little tricks I've learned about interviewing, that I think is helpful as a researcher when you're conducting research interviews, to think of the person on the other side of the table as you're trying to get them to be your research assistant. You're trying to get them to help you understand what's going on. And if you think of it that way, and sometimes you can actually get them intrigued and say, you know, I'm just trying to understand this. I'm a researcher. Can you help me understand it? You know, it's just a straightforward request for some enlightenment about a subject that person probably knows a great deal more about than you do. And if you can get them responding to that kind of a lead, I think they assume some sense of concern about getting the story straight and making sure you're not mixed up about it, and find out how it really works, and and all those things that will help you get good data. And I think we too often think of the person on the other side of the table as the psychologists always use the terminology subject, S1, S2, and so forth. And I think that might condition thinking a little bit, but instead of saying, here's the person that's my my research assistant trying to educate me about something they know more about than I do. It gives you a little different way to structure the interview, and it's I think an important supplement to questionnaires, any other form, and can often help you from making, as a researcher, some pretty silly mistakes.
Are there any other topics on there that you'd like to talk about at some length, or maybe training of doctoral students, or in more detail some of the field work you're doing or currently doing? Feel free to go into any of that.
Well, how much more time?
As much as you want. We can go as long as you want.
Well, the only thing about my current work that might possibly be of interest is that I've combined quite traditional historical research on organizations with field work on their current issues and current problems. So it's sort of trying to do most of it is looking back through time, through the records in terms of history, but kind of bringing it up to some contemporary events by adding field work in those same organizations on it as a way to bring it as close as possible to the present circumstances. So that I think fieldwork can add on to and hook on to other methods like history, like certainly laboratory work. I think another thing I've been involved in is action research in the field, and I've done quite a bit of that one time or another. That has some very special problems to it, and I think that by action research, I better say that what I mean is that one is in there as a participant in the affairs, where you're in there to be in a role as a consultant or in some other way as an active advisor, trying to be of help to the organization you're working with, even as you record and document and keep a careful research record of the events. So you're there both as a participant and as a researcher. It is hard to keep those roles sorted out. Anybody that thinks it's easy is kidding themselves. The roles do complicate life. It is a rather humbling process usually, because what you're usually documenting is the fact that it's very hard to change organizations, and that your efforts as a consultant, when you stay with it and look at the consequences, often is rather keeps us humble. But I think it is argued that is one way to learn a lot about organizations, is to try and change them, and that's an old adage that comes down from Kurt Lewin's days, and there's truth to that. I don't think there are other problems about action research. It's hard to get clearance on the data. It is because it's usually pretty sensitive for the company involved. It does lead people to look at that kind of research and say, well, you know, does that meet the usual standards of objectivity? And there are good reasons to ask those questions. What my experience is that if you want to get the findings out of action research, you better let them age for a while and then come back to them later on. Both it'll help you get the clearance and it'll make you more objective when you don't have as much of your own ego involved in the outcome as you do at the time. And you can stand back and look at it with a little more dispassionate way. So I think it is a type of research that takes a lot of time. Action, you know, it's online, so you got to let some things evolve. That takes time, and then I think you almost always have to age the findings before you're going to get them published. I think very good. Speaking of doctoral training, I think I feel somewhat remiss myself in working with our doctoral students here that I haven't done a more systematic job of giving people as rich an experience of field work as I think we should be able to. We give them a lot of field work, but I don't know that we always do it as systematically and as extensively as we should. And I aspire to do more of that. I think but it's excellent training. I think it not only teaches you a lot about organizations, but it teaches you some good habits of maintaining your research documentation. You have to do your field notes every day religiously, or you lose them. You know, you can retain them in your mind for a couple hours, but that's about it. If you wait till the next morning, they're gone. And the tape recorders help, but one trouble with a tape recorder, it collects so much information that always have trouble sorting it out and figuring out what to do with it after you got it. So I still believe that for many purposes, note-taking is still the best way, and the reconstruction of the conversation as soon as possible afterwards is still the best way to do your field documentation. And it's a good thing to learn to do.
What are some of the other typical problems that a new field researcher would face, you know, the typical doctoral student going out today doing his or her field?
Well, one thing is that you feel awkward when you go into a place and you're there to be an observer and not a part of the action. People don't understand that role. They obviously they feel awkward around you because they don't know what you're there for. You know, they can't understand that. Just soaking stuff up, and that makes you feel awkward, and you feel useless, and you know, you kind of wish to kind of hide somewhere. And you just have to confront that feeling and recognize that's one of the prices of doing it, and forget it. Keep going. So it is a awkward thing, but people do get used to that, and you find that you know you can build good relationships of where you can learn a lot. I think it's hard when you're in the field not to become identified with some subset of the organization. The people who are friendliest to you first, you know, boy, that feels so good to have some friendly faces when you go in there, a bunch of strangers, that it's very easy to become identified with their causes, with their outlook, and you begin to look at those people they call enemies as, you know, really black-hearted types that are partly your enemies. And you have to force yourself to go over and spend a lot of time hanging around the enemies until they get to be friends too. So you can open up communication with them as well as with the other folks, so that, and it's really a great achievement when you can, you know, the two groups are in an absolute Cold War, or sometimes more than that, with each other, and you can walk in there and you make the rounds and everybody telling you exactly what's going on and what's the latest scoop on those SOPs down the hall, and then you walk out there and walk in down the hall and start, they can see you down there carrying on the same conversations with the enemy. And you know, when you come back over here and they don't say, what the hell are you doing now? And when they say, fine, now we'll tell you the next round of events, you know you've got something accomplished. You can cross the trenches, cross the no man's land, and get good information on both sides. And so you have to manage your own identification process very carefully.
What about ethical problems, confidentiality?
Well, I think it's complicated. I think you have to think about that very hard before you start. Then you have to make your commitments to people about what ground rules you're going to play by. And then you're locked in, you have to stick with them. And sometimes you wish you could get out of them because it's costing you some good information you can't use, or in other ways limiting what you can do to serve your own purposes. But and there are different ground rules for different kinds of research. I don't think some ground rules I've worked under is where you say to each and every individual, what I learned from you will be shown to absolutely no one else until you have gone over each and every line of it and tell me it's okay, right down to the individual. So you get clearance one by one. That's a pretty demanding way of getting data, and yet I've done that, and it can be done. There are other circumstances where I think it is reasonable, and as long as people understand what the ground rules are, to say, you know, I'm trying to understand this overall situation, and we get all done, we're going to clear it with so-and-so, and that person is going to act as the agent of the whole organization to clear this, and we will disguise it, so then he will assure that it's disguised in such a way that it can't come back to any individual, because any individual's comment is going to be thrown in with a bunch of others and scrambled up, so you know you don't have to worry about any adverse consequences. So you got to design your ground rules for confidentiality based on the particular circumstances, what kind of data you're going to get, what kind of findings you want to report, what kinds of specificity you want to put into it. But if you want to describe an organization in such a way that you really describe the organization and its players, there's no way just that statement by itself says that anybody who's in that system can look at your report and say, this, you you know, regardless of what the name is on there, say this is so-and-so and this is so-and-so and this, you know, they're all doing their individual roles. It's perfectly obvious and conspicuous who's who. And when you want to have report outs of that kind, that's the kind where you got to, you know, face the fact that that you have to go on a one-by-one clearance process with all the time consuming. You write it all up and you cut it up into little slivers, just those little quotes that you want to use of this individual, and you just patch all those together. Then the question comes, does that tell them anything? Because I don't know what's surrounding, you know, what the context is. But how much context can you show that person without saying, you know, something about the person down the hall that's part of the context, you know? So it gets complicated. But I think it, you know, it doesn't mean it can't be done. It is done.
Basically, it's very hard for the diehards, some of the diehards on the other side of the river, to see a difference between the journalist who goes in and does an expose on an organization, as opposed to some of the softer field research that goes on this side of the river. And obviously, it's, you know, they have their heads in certain directions, and the heads are in different directions over here. But I do think that's a common, you know, idea. Maybe you can address what in your mind differentiates good from bad field research, or this other type of sort of journalistic, sensational type.
Well, I think it is in the comes down essentially to the you know, the professional standards that the individual brings to the work, and the purposes they're trying to serve with this work. If you're trying to simply attract attention in a media sense, you know, you have to, according to the current ground rules, you know, sort of have something that has some sensational aspect to it. I think that the I don't, you know, whether the thing is sensational or not is, though, as far as I'm concerned, kind of beside the point. What is behind that question is really, are people being rigorous in their care with which, and accuracy with which they're reporting what's going on, and if the accurate and rigorous reporting leads to something that attracts a lot of attention, well, so be it. If it does, fine. If it doesn't, that's got nothing to do with the question of rigor and accuracy. And I think that anytime you rely on a human observer as the instrument of inquiry, there will inevitably be questions, and perfectly reasonable questions, raised about the precision of that observer, and that is. But I think that it's why I think part of field research training has to put a lot of emphasis on keeping the record straight, getting your documentation done, you know, keeping when you're quoting people, quote them, you know, as it came out. And and I think that the one thing that I try to emphasize to doctoral students, that good researchers don't fight their data. I mean, why fight it? It is what you're after, is the way it is. And if you start fighting your data and trying to, and get in your mind that somewhere or other, you know, that the world isn't supposed to be that way, I'm supposed to kind of make it look a little different. The only person you're kidding is yourself, because, you know, research is a question of understanding phenomenon, and quality researchers that develop a sound basis for a good reputation are ones who don't fight their data. They go with it and go with the grain and see what it is, and have the openness of mind and to observe it for what's there, and capture that in a form that then becomes useful to other people.
What is it? So that's one of the things you find most satisfying about doing field research, actually capturing what's going on, and you had also mentioned really understanding social systems and social hierarchies and organizations. Right. What other sort of things are most satisfying for you in field research?
Well, I think field research, I think, is not unique about this, but it is possible in field research to pick topics for study that have the attributes of being able to, as you learn more about them, you can both make a contribution to theory, to the general knowledge, body of knowledge, and also a contribution to a problem. And it is possible to combine, research inquiries that combine those two purposes in field research. And it isn't the only way you can do it. I mean, you can do it in laboratory research and so forth. But I don't know, I guess I'm a little prejudiced, but I think that field research is more apt to, you're more apt to find ways to combine those two in a single project. So that's one plus. I think it also makes it somewhat easier to bridge between your purposes as a researcher and your role as a teacher. Field research is, of course, you're trained in the first instance to get research findings out, to make a research product that adds to knowledge. But in the course of doing that, you can learn things that enrich your capacity as a teacher, and you often, as a byproduct, can come out with teaching materials that are useful in class. So that I think it makes it somewhat easier doing that kind of research to bridge between those two aspects of an academic life.
Mm-hmm. The future of field research, Sam had mentioned how this new video explosion is going to influence the way mm-hmm. people do research. Mm-hmm. Now that more and more companies are becoming very aware of this whole push towards employee satisfaction and keeping in touch with employee needs and manager needs and growth awareness stuff, how that's going to influence organizations' perceptions of researchers coming in and doing field research.
Well, one thing I think is beginning to happen, you commented earlier on the observation that nowadays questionnaires are a very popular form of doing research, and lends itself, the data comes out of it to more quantitative manipulation and so forth. Certainly that's true, but I think there's a counter trend developing now toward more use of in contemporary research topics of anthropological field methods that, after all, they were the people that have been most consistently dedicated to field research over the years, and have certainly learned a lot about how to do good field research. And we've, in OB, have drawn on that as one of our, basic disciplines to learn from. But I think that there's a lot more talk about it. If you look at the topics that come up in professional meetings now, you see more evidence of that. The interest is growing in things like understanding organizational cultures. Well, how do you do that? You got to probably, in most instances, get in and do some direct observation interviewing. The whole trend to try to understand the myths, the norms, the rituals, the latent belief patterns of an organization requires a lot of that kind of work. If you're trying to get any kind of a more latent phenomenon, asking check one of 5 boxes on a questionnaire is unlikely to capture it for you. So the topics that are being studied more, are pushing it back toward those methods. So I think it's these things come and go, and I think it's swinging back in that direction. And I think that the emphasis on applied work, trying to find ways in which the behavioral sciences can be of more use in contemporary affairs, that is also leading us more into the field, because that's where the problems are, and that's where you got to study them and learn about them to get into applied work. So I think there's a number of trends that are leading toward that. I think that there was a while that some schools felt, as a matter of pride in the product of their doctoral students, that if a dissertation wasn't a dissertation unless it was full of numbers and a lot of computer calculations, and that is a qualitative study, no matter how carefully done and how rich of a rich field experience, may be fine, but it's not a dissertation, it's not doctoral work. Well, I think that's a pretty parochial view, and I think more and more first-class schools are recognizing that's a much too limited a definition of research. We learn about the affairs around us in many different ways, and we can't, it's stupid to preclude the full array of research apparatus as being relevant to good research.
And this whole push that we're both experiencing, this interdisciplinary push from both sides of the river, you think that'll become more apparent as people from both sides of the river look to other disciplines for ways of doing research?
Yeah, I think so. I think that field work tends to lead you into multidisciplinary kinds of issues. And, you need concepts from a variety of disciplines to take account of something that is there for analysis, you know, from the level of the individual to the group to the larger system. You got to move back and forth between levels of analysis to understand it. You need concepts and methods drawn from many disciplines. I think that's characteristic of applied work. The real world doesn't come up in nice little compartments saying this is an issue of psychology and this is an issue of sociology. Obviously, those are just complex problems.
One final question. And then feel free to talk about anything else you want to. Who do you think, what's the real hot field research going on today? Who's doing some interesting work? People that you know, things that you think will really have an impact on the way people view field research techniques or interesting projects in the future? I'm not sure I can give a very good answer. One method we haven't talked about that was used for many years, I'm beginning to see a couple signs of us picking up, is what we always call participant observation. And there we were thinking not so much of action research a la kind of a consulting role, but just going in as a member of the workforce and keeping a documented track of what you can see from that kind of a working role in a ongoing organization. But I've seen a couple things in the literature lately that some people are you know, going back and doing more of that. It's a pretty time-consuming method again, and I saw one item that said that somebody got a book out and going back to a factory where there was a fellow named Roy that did participant observation something over 30 years ago, and somebody's gone back as a worker in the same department where Roy did his original work and took in a job, and he's got a book out on it now. 30 years later in the same shop, and I guess I haven't read it, but I guess the point is that not much has changed. But I see those sort of straws in the wind. I don't know of any one project which is going to, you know, have the kind of milestone impact. Let's say, looking back, we can look at obvious things like the Hawthorne studies or other comparable things, early work of Lewin with boys' clubs and so forth. I don't see anything of that kind, but that doesn't mean that I may just not be aware of it. Is this Japanese approach to management, is this you think a fad, or is this a swing in the opposite direction where people are really getting involved and from all levels of the hierarchy?
Well, there's no question that the capacity of Japanese to be effective competitors, and the second fact that clearly one of their secrets of their success is the way they manage people, has put a lot of leverage on that topic, and it is brought it front and center to American managers currently in a way that I don't think it's going to go away any more than you know, whenever somebody finds a better way to do something, the rest of the world has to pay attention to it, and it's not anything that's unique to Japan. I mean, those are things that, well, there are some cultural conditions there that make their ability to do some of these things it's a little easier perhaps than it would be in this country. I don't think there's any reason to think it's unique and only possible in Japan. So no, I don't think it's a temporary thing. As long as they are such powerful competitors, we're going to have to pay attention.
Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or make a summary statement? Feel free.
No, I think that the I don't doubt you're getting a lot of different kinds of things discussed that are sort of triggered by the label field research, and I would simply emphasize that that is such a variable category that I'm very pleased you're doing what you're doing. Partly because I think it should help us understand the many varieties of it. That it is not a unitary thing, and that is one of the things that, of course, adds to its value is that it comes in many different forms, and that I think one mistake that I think people are apt to make, and I mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to emphasize it, is to design their research and do all their thinking about what the questions are and how they're going to collect their data and so forth, without getting through the door of the place they want to gather data to take a look at what's going on there, so that they are not their plan isn't completely out of phase with what's there, and the more they hang around there, then they will begin to find things like these unobtrusive observations that have been written about, and very valuable suggestions come out of that. You don't discover those things, the unobtrusive measures, until you've been around a place for a while, and I think that's unfortunately too many people think they've got to have it all figured out before they open the door.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was very interesting.